Hey there everyone, I'm Queen, and I'm making the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild mechanics in virtual reality. So this project originated when I was having my lunch break with my best friend, and I posed a question about how classic game mechanics would work in a virtual reality environment. After that conversation, the question evolved into wondering how specifically Breath of the Wild's mechanics would translate into VR. I decided that the way VR controllers tend to interact with virtual environments is actually quite similar to how the Sheikah Slate uses the runes. For example, if Link selects the Magnesis rune and points the Sheikah Slate at a metal object, he can throw that object around as he pleases. Compare that to classic VR games in which you can point at an object and practically force pull it towards yourself. About 3 months later, I thought to myself, you know what? I have an Oculus Gear VR headset with some VR development experience. If I'm so sure these mechanics make sense in VR, why don't I try and make it in my spare time? So here I am, 2 weeks after deciding to do this, making a video about it. Since Magnesis was the first rune I imagined working in VR, it made sense that would be the first one I make. Because this is something I'm doing in my spare time, whilst I study, I'm not going to put too much pressure on myself. I'll start by making the basic mechanic functionality, then I'll make them look flashy. Eventually, I might end up making it look botwa-esque if I can do it without getting copyrighted. Firstly, I set up a pretty simple mechanic which would attach to the player object, and used a raycast to find any object it might hit. Check if that object was interactable, which later I'll change to identify whether it's metal or anything else for the other runes, and pick it up or drop it depending on input. Originally, I started with getting Magnesis working on PC, only to realize there wasn't really much point in doing that since I had a headset I could use for testing whenever I needed. So I started implementing the VR functionality and hit a roadblock. Every single time I went to test the build, my headset said the Oculus needed to update, but there was no update available. I couldn't believe after posting that I was going to do this, when I had hardly even started, it was already looking like I wouldn't be able to do it. I hadn't developed anything for the Gear VR in about a year, so I didn't realize that Oculus had stated that they've discontinued updates and compatibility for the Gear VR. Luckily, they listed the correct versions of Unity and Oculus integration that would work with the Gear, both of which are available on their download archives. After remaking the scene in the correct version of Unity and setting everything up for VR, it was time to test. And it still wouldn't work. After some faffing, it turned out that using your phone's IMEI doesn't work anymore, and you specifically need the phone's hardware ID, which can be found using an app. Finally, it worked, and I could breathe a sigh of relief. So now that testing was working, I realized I made a pretty simple mistake that prevented me from letting go of objects. After fixing that by slightly adjusting my code and making some simple visual feedback, it was still acting differently than expected. It turned out that while I was remaking the scene in the older version of Unity, I forgot to put rigid bodies on the blocks. After fixing that, it was behaving a bit more as expected, but I encountered a pretty funny bug that caused the blocks to stay attached to my controller whilst they flew away. I adjusted my code further to stop multiple blocks being picked up at once, and allow them to be let go of even if they weren't hitting the raycast. When adding the push and pull mechanic, I was hoping I could map it to the volume buttons, but unfortunately they're reserved, so I tried mapping it to the touchpad by swiping using D-pad up and down, but when I tested that it didn't seem to do anything. In the end, I mapped them to tapping or pressing the touchpad. Unfortunately, working with the Gear has its limitations, and I can't afford a more advanced headset. So that's the basic functionality of Magnesis done. I did notice that the blocks didn't have the momentum I wanted when I let go of them. They just dropped down instead of falling in the direction I threw them. Since I've run out of development time for this video, there are still some bugs, and it doesn't look like much yet. Once I've finished the basics of each rune, I'll come back to Magnesis and tidy it up. Unfortunately, this first video doesn't show much development. That's partly because of all the technical difficulties and my uni assessments coming first, but I also figured this video would be a sort of short introduction to the series. I'll be uploading the next video with the Stasis and Cryonis runes basic functionality done on the 21st of March, in other words, in a month on the Saturday at 11:30 PM Australian Eastern Standard Time. Thanks for watching everyone, I'll see you later.